Okay, so we're going to talk about building state capability, and we're going to introduce what we call a PDIA approach. And of course, it wouldn't be a legitimate approach if it didn't have an acronym that was impenetrable. Because that hopefully piques you, like, what in the world does that mean? And basically, we're concerned with this big problem of the state capability for policy implementation. There's a lot of talk about what the right policy ought to be. You know, what should the government be trying doing? But one of the problems we're now facing, and is becoming increasingly obvious, is that no matter how attractive your policies, if you don't actually have the capability embedded in the organizations to get it done, it doesn't do you that much good. So kind of what state capability means is that you have organizations in which you can induce agents to do the right thing to accomplish their objectives. It's not that hard to define, so that's police forces that actually kind of help enforce the law. Teachers that actually sort of act and do what they need to do so that kids learn. Central bankers that make good macroeconomic choices. Doctors that, when they're actually in their practices, treat patients so that they get better. So this is, though, turning out to be an enormously challenging problem, because the way is blocked by very fixed ideas about what governmental organizations ought to look like and act like. One of the things of development has been there's a whole bunch of things that we kind of, as development, knew needed to happen, and we created a variety of governmental organizations to make them happen. And the problem we're facing now is that in many countries around the world, the public sector mechanisms that have been created to deliver services just aren't working. So the agents that have been hired, equipped, the facilities have been built, aren't delivering on the services that they were meant to do at anything like the way we thought they were going to do it. So this is just one example from a state in India, which is interesting because they've built out public clinics in order to have universally available free public clinics. But they compared the actual performance of how well individual patients got treated between public and private providers, and what they found was across the board, the public sector providers just did less, even though the public sector providers were more trained on average than the private sector providers. They were better doctors. By any objective measure of their qualifications as practitioners, they were better doctors, but they just did less. This is the ratio of public to private. The visits lasted 2.4 minutes, only 40% as long as the visits in the private sector. Only 12% even checked the pulse. Only 27% of what they did in the private sector. And only 2.6% of interactions with public sector doctors and public sector clinics ended up with the right diagnosis. So really, you've got this entire apparatus of delivering healthcare services that is delivering effectively no healthcare services at all. They're not even really reaching do no harm, because you're getting the wrong diagnosis just vastly more, and they only got 28% only 28% as often did they get the right diagnosis. Okay? Here's the kicker. When they looked at the quality of care by provider, the worst care of all was by the public sector doctors in their public sector clinics. The best care given in rural Madhya Pradesh was those exact same public sector doctors in their private clinic hours. So it wasn't the doctor. It was the organization that the doctor was embedded in that reduced their productivity. Rather than being embedded in the organization increasing their productivity, it actually reduced their productivity, so that when they were actually working on their own account, they behaved exactly like the private sector doctors, and since they were more trained, they did better. So the best care in rural Madhya Pradesh are public sector doctors. The worst care in rural Madhya Pradesh are public sector doctors. What the difference is the organizational setting that they're embedded in, and the public sector organizational setting is not only reducing their productivity, it's reducing their absolute productivity relative to what they can do. So if you look at sort of just indicators of countries of what governments can do, what we see is that a long ways into the development process, we have countries, recent study just did a simple test of a simple government function like delivering the mail. They just mailed a bunch of letters to countries, misaddressed, and then saw how many of them came back. Because part of the International Postal Code is that if you get a foreign letter and it's misaddressed in your own country, you return it to the country of origin. What they found was that in high capability countries like Czech Republic and Finland, 90% to 100% of the letters came back within 90 days. Turns out Colombia, where are the Colombians? We've got lots of Colombians here. Colombia was a super high capability post office country. 90% of the letters came back within 90 days. But there were 25 countries where 0 letters came back in 90 days. It was as if you had mailed them into a black hole. Just they never came back. And this didn't just include Somalia. Obviously, if I mail a letter to Somalia, I don't expect it to come back, return to sender address unknown, right? But this included countries like Tanzania, Ghana, Nigeria, Honduras, countries that are countries. And yet their post office has been a post office, has been an independently political sovereign post office for 50 years, and there's no evidence that it has any capability at all. The capability has not been developed to carry out the functions of the post office. So this stagnation in capability is the intellectual puzzle we're posting. So if we take an aggregate indicator, not just of the post office, but a ranking of quality of government, and we look at how quality of a government is evolving over time, it kind of breaks into 3 groups of countries. There's the F states, where F can stand for anything you want. Failed, failing, fractured, fragile, effed up. These are really bad capability countries. These are countries where just, really the government is incapable of carrying out even the most minimal functions. And that's a lot of countries. There's 31 countries that are kind of in this condition. Then, interestingly, there's only 12 successful countries where we define success as either a developing country that's come above the lowest of an OECD country level, so surpassed 6.5 on this ranking, which is where Portugal is, and we take Portugal of kind of the minimum threshold of developmentness because Europeans play soccer with Portugal. That's the basic reason. So that's the lowest of the countries that are considered OECD. There's only 8 countries that have gotten above that. Israel, Korea, Chile, Taiwan, Singapore. Very few of them have gotten above that. Then what you have is you have this huge muddle in the middle. What's the muddle in the middle? These aren't countries that are failed states. These aren't countries that are in conflict. These aren't countries where it's completely incapable. Except Syria. Well, except Syria. I'm sorry. This was, sorry. As of 2008, which was the date at which we kind of did this ranking. So Syria is now down here, obviously. But anyway, but the point is that there's only, of the countries kind of in the middle tier of capability, only 4 of them seem to be making positive progress over the last 10 years. Colombia, Indonesia, Turkey, and Tanzania were the only ones that were making progress such that it would take them less than 100 years to get to the OECD levels. So everybody in here, at their current pace of progress at developing capability of the state as basic bureaucratic capability, rule of law, and lack of corruption, everybody in here is kind of muddling along, either at negative pace, which is where most of them are, where it actually seems that we're going backwards, or at a very slow pace, where Mexico, at its current pace, would take it, I think, the calculation's in a paper somewhere, but Mexico at its current pace of progress, although it's positive, would take it another 250 years to even get to the level of Portugal. So somehow we're stuck in this bad dynamic of very slow aggregate progress in the capability of states. So kind of whatever it is we're doing, it's not working out so well in most places. There's some places like Taiwan, Korea, Chile, it's worked out. Some places where it appears to be working out. But the vast majority of countries are either stuck in an F state or they're muddling in the middle. They're not really making positive progress. And so we need to think, what's our theory of change? How do we get out of this negative dynamic? So,
Could I just jump in and ask you a question? There's
sure.
100 other countries
No. But these are the only 98 countries that really matter, because the rest of them are either OECD, which is 20 or 5 or so, or they're tiny little ones that we don't really care about. So, I mean, unless you happen to live there, and then which we care about them a ton. But 98 is kind of most developing countries with more than 1 million population are in this sample. This isn't a selective sample, but once you throw out the OECD and you throw out the tiny ones, this is kind of everybody. So the problem is we're really in this state, which is even harder, because there's a saying that if you're going to cross, you can't cross a chasm in 2 jumps. Right? Well, why can't you cross a chasm in 2 jumps? Well, because on your second jump, you're at the bottom of the chasm and your legs are broken because you failed on the first jump. Well, it's not as if we're in the first jump of developing state capability. Nearly every country in the world has had some dynamic of state capability, and we're now actually thinking about what's our second jump at building state capability. It's not like we got a blank slate in any country in the world. They've been independent for 50 years, and they are where they are. Now, the problem with being they are where they are is we now have to think of not only what we would have done maybe had we been able to go back to when the country was first being founded, but what do you do when your first jump's failed? What do you do when you've made your first jump and you're now stuck and stagnant? That's a much trickier problem for two reasons. One is that organizations that have survived failure have developed defensive mechanisms to allow them to survive failure. They've developed mechanisms that we call isomorphic mimicry, which is a form of camouflage, which is if we look like we're a functional organization, we can generate legitimacy and survival even though we're not delivering. So how many of you have been in a country where the routinely policemen don't wear uniforms? How many of you have been in a country where policemen are corrupt? Okay. So what's the object of a uniform that a policeman wears? It's to signal something. It's to signal that they're the police. Does it signal functionality? Does it signal that they're going to enforce the law? No. So you've managed to disassociate the signal from the reality as a camouflage mechanism that provides you survival value. Once you've developed this camouflage, this can be, so some of these are bees and some of these are flies. Which one would you swat? Well, none of them, because they all look like bees. And I don't want to swat a bee because I might get stung. So if I can develop, if I'm a fly, but looks like a bee, it provides me a lot of advantages. So what we have around the world is lots of things that look like schools, but we don't really have a lot of internal metrics that let us know whether there's really learning going on in those schools. Because as long as they have books and tables and uniforms, it's a school. Right? And we continue to fund it, we continue to promote it, we continue to allow it to exist. There's no metric that can kind of force it out. So what we're trying to think of is we're trying to guess at what the solution to this problem might look like. And we start, with an insight that, problems can't be solved at the same level at which they were created. So it's unlikely to be, if we've been stuck with stagnant state capability for 50 years of history, that the solution to stagnant state capability is going to look exactly like what we've been trying for the last 50 years. Sooner or later, there's 2 sayings in the world. One is, if at first you don't succeed, try again. The second is, the definition of crazy is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So when people say try again, they mean try something different. Edison didn't invent the light bulb by trying the same filament 2,000 times, right? He tried 10,000 different filaments because he was experimenting. So our sort of 4 principles of how you would build state capability are PDIA, local solutions for local problems, pushing problem-driven positive deviance, iterate and adapt, and scale through to fusion. So let me just talk very briefly about each of what we mean by each of these. And again, you noticed that the groups that had the most difficult time with our exercise were the ones that we had provided a blueprint. By providing them a blueprint, we tricked them, wasn't at all a fair exercise. It wasn't meant to be a fair exercise. It was meant to be a teaching exercise. We provided them with these beautiful looking blueprints for paper airplanes. So what did they do? They said, let's build one of these cool paper airplanes, right? They're so cool looking, and they are cool. So the blueprint actually became an inhibitor to a flexible interpretation of solving the problem you were given. So we're not, so what we're trying to emphasize is that in no way do we want to recreate a blueprint for public administration. We want to create sort of principles of an alternative approach. So the first is local solutions for local problems. We want to nominate problems. So this exercise was driven by a problem. You want to take a piece of paper that can go through a hula hoop and go the furthest, right? It was a concrete problem in which you could specify sort of what it was that we wanted the end product to look like, independently of how you did it. So again, we tricked some of the groups into thinking it was a paper airplane exercise, but really it was a problem exercise. And the people that realized it was a problem exercise had enormous flexibility in how they came about it, because they knew what the metrics were. And then they could go out, and these guys experimented with scissors and all kinds of things, and who was the best thrower. But if you don't have the right definition of the problem, you can't go looking for solutions. And in particular, if you start with a definition of the problem where the problem is the lack of a solution, you can't unleash creativity. So if you say, the problem with our schools is they don't have desks, then the only possible solution to that problem is putting desks. You've already defined the problem in a solution way, right? So that's the first thing. You've got to define the problem in a way where it's a problem. And it's a problem that's solvable. It's a problem that you can have metrics about. It's a problem that you'll know when you have solved it, but without defining it in such a way that you've defined the solution into the problem. And these are examples. The second is to push problem-driven positive deviation. Now, what do we mean by that? What we mean is that you have to authorize some agents in your organization to do something different. You've got to empower them to go out and do something other than follow the rules. So there's going to be some trade-off. Large numbers of your agents, you just want following the rules, right? But some number of your agents inside your organization, you want to authorize to try and solve problems in what we roughly call an autonomy for performance accountability swap, which is we're going to give you more autonomy to go out and do different things, but against this well-defined problem. We're not just going to say, go do anything you want. We're going to say, go try and solve this problem. So this is a sort of the one way of approaching things is you think inside your organization, you've got rent seekers, bureaucrats, and innovators. And so your kind of goal as a policymaker, I'm going to design the best policy, the best practice policy, and then what I want to do is set up process controls that ensure that nobody cheats on my policy, right? So I'll prevent anyone from, cheating on my policy to prevent the rent seekers, the lazy and the not well motivated in my organization from distorting it. The only problem is that the process controls also prevent positive deviations, prevent people moving into parts of the space where it's actually better at solving your problem than what you've already invented. So the process controls can actually work symmetrically to prevent innovation, where you can get to higher outcomes in this space, in the interest of preventing these terrible outcomes. This is a perfectly legitimate thing to worry about. So what you want to think, which narrows the space for achievable practice, discourages the entry of these people into the public sector or into your organization, right? Encourages them to go elsewhere. And oftentimes then what happens is these break down for these guys anyway, right? Your organization starts to drift this way, because since you lose the most driven and motivated people in your organization starts to drift this way, and you get the worst of both worlds. The process controls don't prevent corruption, but they do prevent innovation. Anybody who's worked in a developing country in any organization has seen this, where the organization is essentially a morass of corruption pretending to follow the rules that's driven all the innovation out of it, because you can't innovate, but you can be corrupt. So you're in the worst of both worlds. So what you want to try and create is a way in which You authorize people, the designated innovators, not everyone can just do whatever the hell they want, but you authorize a process where for locally nominated problems inside your organization, designated innovators get to move with policy deviations into parts of the space that normally would be out of the process controls, with this tight feedback on outcomes, right? So that's my innovation, is getting PowerPoint to move. I actually had to have a student do that for me. I'm over 50, so I'm exempt from learning new things. So what you want to do is then what happens is once you get the innovations going, then they can be imitated and become the new achievable practice. So you get your organization dynamically moving and building its capability by being dragged by the designated innovators towards things that are demonstrated to work. Okay? So, and no one ever accuses me of having too few animal metaphors, right? But if you want to get a turtle to move, if you attack the turtle, what happens? Pulls up inside its shell. And you can't defeat it because it's got a hard shell. That's how turtles have survived, is having a hard shell, right? So to get the turtle to move, what do you have to do? You've got to get the head to come out. You've got to get some people in that organization moving at that direction and pull the rest of the turtle with it. So frontal attacks on kind of an organization that has developed the capability to survive without functionality are unlikely to be successful, because in part of their survival has been they've learned how to play defense, right? So oftentimes frontal attacks on corruption get thwarted really easily because the organization circles the wagons and becomes sort of impenetrable to outsiders. Whereas if you go inside the organization and try and pull the people who want to pull the organization out, the organization gets pulled from inside. Okay? Okay. So the third part of this is try, learn, iterate, and adapt. And our phrase is, it's all about me. I mean, that's a phrase that resonates with most Harvard professors anyway. But what we mean by that is monitoring, experiential learning, and impact evaluation, which is all three of them provide feedback, and feedback's of different type. So and they're integrated into a process of, we have a problem, we're trying to solve it, we have metrics whether we're solving it, and we get rapid feedback loops into the actual management of the organization based on the performance metrics we have. Okay? So, and I'm not going to go through this because this is in a paper that is going to come out in hopefully a few days. But what this means is it's a dynamic process. So again, the people that were given no blueprints at all, but allowed to experiment very quickly, sort of said, geez, let's try this, let's try that, let's try the other. And you could very quickly iterate because you knew your performance objectives and you could experiment, right? So what you want is to think, what are the key dimensions of the design space? How are the different ways we could fold this paper, right? Select variants you want to try out, try those variants, and loop back. So again, the important thing we're talking about here, though, is experiential learning. You don't need to wait for the final impact evaluation 4 years out to try and get the program to work in the next 6 months, or the next 3 months, or the next year, because then eventually you want to do to something you can scale and do impact evaluation. And the fourth sort of principle of this is the way in which learning is going to diffuse. And when Matt talked about the different types of problems, we characterize analytically different types of problems between pure logistical problems, which lend themselves easily to sort of top-down, technologically embedded, I think that's not how you spell embedded, by the way. But anyway, top-down, technologically embedded sort of things, to more kind of what Matt was calling complex, but what I more locally call wicked hard. These are wicked hard problems. The problems where you really need to have experimentation and adaptation to solve them. There just isn't going to be a logistical solution like running a post office. You really are going to have your street level actors, your regulators acting with concern, with care, with innovation, and they've got to have the power to do it. And in these cases, you're going to have a different model of learning of how your agents in your organization are going to learn, because you can't just train people follow these 6 steps unless you really have a logistical problem. If you want high-quality teachers, you need to train them to care about the outcome and give them the autonomy to act to achieve the outcome. You can't reduce it to do these 6 things in minute 1 and do these 6 things in minute 2. So this actually may seem like common sense. What could be more common sense than define a problem, try a bunch of solutions, have feedback on the problem, and have your organization learn by diffusion? This has got to be common sense, right? Well, it might be common sense, but it's the exact opposite of the way in which most development projects work. Most development projects work on externally nominated, solution-driven criteria. We know what a good civil service looks like, so when we do a civil service project, it is going to be replicating the criteria of a civil service. You're going to have lots of advanced planning for action with very little feedback. We're going to tell you 8 years in advance what your disbursements in year 5 are going to be, right? You're going to have very long and loose feedback loops, and your scaling is going to be top-down. The head is going to learn, the body's going to listen, right? And our sort of PDIA is almost exact opposite of the way in which most development projects unfold. So that is the rubrics of our principles, which we are just sort of in the same way that you were experimenting with different things. We're trying to crawl our way towards what we think the principles of success in building capability from the situations that we're in. Meaning we're trying to build capability in situations in which we know there's been lots of failure and in which we know there is the organizations themselves have developed hard and resistant mechanisms to their own improvement or to their own external attack. So let me stop there.